Welcome, everyone, to the ISM Rochester Lunch and Learn webinar series. Our program for today, as you can see, is Turn Your SOW into a Supplier Improvement Plan, Performance Plan. Please be sure to participate and put your comments and questions in the chat box. We're also going to be doing a few polls, so please, we do ask for your participation because that would actually make this a more interactive program for everybody, and we'd love to hear your answers as well. Our speaker for today would be Brandon Hummons. I actually adore this gentleman. He is great. Brandon has both his CPSM and his CPSD, and he also has his own consulting business as well. Brandon, I know, has been a frequent speaker during the ISM International Conference as well. At this time, I'm going to turn the program over to Brandon so he can actually tell you a little bit about his background as well, and then start the program.
Sure. Thank you very much for that, Kathy. I really appreciate it. And everybody, I'm super excited to be here with you today. We have about an hour that we're going to spend together. But before we just jump into that, like Kathy said, my name is Brandon Hummons. I've been doing procurement, strategic sourcing and procurement for about 12, 13 years now. Started my career off at Allstate, jumped around quite a bit. And eventually I've landed at Walgreens as the senior category manager of their infrastructure and technology department. So handling a lot of things dealing with data center, networking, cloud infrastructure, things of that nature. And a lot of my background is in IT procurement. I spent some time as a procurement consultant, bounced around to quite a few different companies on some strategic projects, including Tropicana, where we worked through over 350 different vendor engagements over the course of about 12, 13 months or so. I am heavily involved in ISM. I'm specifically involved in ISM Chicago as well. We do a lot of cross-chapter activity. But I am on the board of directors for our Chicago chapter. And I also started our Emerging Leaders Committee, which is all about how do we give people more events that are going to help them launch their careers forward. So what you're in for today, everyone, is a little bit of something new. We haven't done this type of webinar in this manner before, but I'm sure there are going to be things that you've seen before. As Kathy said, there are going to be some poll questions, some that have multiple choice, and others where you're going to need to insert a little bit of your own words and whatnot. I like that part the most. I'm going to spend about 30 minutes, so about half the webinar today, on that section, because I may come with my own experiences, but I really want to hear from all of the people that we have in the call. Your experiences and your shared knowledge is truly going to be the precipice of the experience today. So the agenda that we're going to go through is I'm going to talk to you guys about the SOW and what we might be doing wrong when it comes to creating them from start to finish to using them as the improvement plan for your vendor management strategy. There are going to be some things in here that I'm going to assume that you know as a procurement professional. So I'm not going to start from just immediate square one and give you a whole bunch of intro level stuff, but rather I really want to dive in on your experiences. I want everybody to kind of treat themselves as though they are a seasoned professional, and that's really what this is designed for. So we're just going to go through at a very basic level. You know, we should all understand that what an SOW is, then moving through and talking about how do we use that SOW to put in an improvement plan, right? How do we actually create the one off of the other? Then we're going to talk about a few of the tools and techniques that are available and how do we actually implement and follow up. And then lastly, like I said before, is going to be our interactive part of the session. So Kathy said before, please put your comments into the chat. Speak up. I'll be keeping a chat box for everybody, for me on the side of the screen, so at least I'll be able to monitor. And let me know if you have any questions along the way or want me to slow down, stop on something, expand on something. Like I said before, the SOW, I'm not going to spend too much time explaining what it is. My assumption here is that everybody's on the same page, but just in case you're not, an SOW is typically a statement of work that includes a scope of work. So both of those having SOW in it. The main difference is your statement of work is your overarching agreement. It typically hangs off of an MSA that really governs the full scope of your agreement. And that MSA has the primary terms and conditions that you're working with. And your SOW should be specific to a stream of work that doesn't kind of go beyond a certain gratitude of scope. And what I mean by that is it has to be specific enough so that you can point to it and say, why are we engaging with this company on an individual level in that way? In addition, it should have exactly what you want to get out of that company relationship. And it should say when you want to receive that, whether it's in milestones over a long period of time, whatever it is. But then most importantly, what people often leave out or simply choose not to enforce are the second from last thing, right? The performance standards. It's us actually defining what constitutes good work. Let's say, for example, you're joining a job. One of the questions that you might ask them is, what do employees in my role need to have in order to be successful? What do they need to show, right? And the reason that you might ask that question for yourself is, I want to understand, what do I need to do as an individual to do a good job for this company, right? Put that at the vendor level, they're going to be asking the same questions, or at least should be asking the same questions, which is, how can I be successful to my client? And then lastly, which is usually most important from my experience, the payment terms, right? That helps you determine what your working capital might be, how quickly you need to pay a vendor, if there are going to be late fees or interest applied, if you miss a payment, a lot of the situations around how the actual money is going to be handled. And typically you can also look at this as including some of the commercials of the agreement in terms of how much are we going to be paying overall. Sometimes that interest rate, or maybe even a buy versus lease option, really goes down to what does the accounting of the agreement say. So that's an SOW. And I wanted to kind of just start with that because that's why we're here. I don't need to expand too much more on it, but I do want to put it in action, right? So we often kind of get this definition of what they are, but here's how it could look in many situations. And also pay attention to this portion because this is going to help us understand how we should be thinking when we do our own exercises, when we create our performance improvement plan. So I'm not going to read everything here, but the premise of it all is we have a company that was dealing with a vendor and they were experiencing delays when dealing with that vendor, as well as poor quality for the materials that were delivered. They want to use their SOW to reshape that working relationship with that supplier. So what you see on the screen is a breakdown of how do we look at each of the sections of that SOW and then have a specific outcome to how we may handle that. So let's say we're talking about the inconsistent deliveries and some of the delays that we're looking at. So I might look at timeline and performance standards. So when we look at timeline, one of the things that we can do in this revamped SOW, because often if it constitutes well enough at any time, you should feel comfortable enough to say, here's an amendment to an original SOW. I know we're not at the expiration of it, but we're allowed to amend it. And here's what I want to insert in each of these sections without tearing the whole thing down and revamping it all, right? We're adding something onto it in this sort of situation. So we could say on the timeline, instead of me saying that you have, you can communicate to me the timeline as a vendor, and you can just let me know each step of the way how often the deliveries are going to be. I'm going to say, here is the exact delivery schedule, and there are going to be penalties if it's delivered late. Now, when it comes to that, there are two things that happen here. One, it's more setting those clear expectations and boundaries with the supplier rather than maybe how it was in the beginning, where you could say, hey, the supplier does delivery in 30 days versus we need delivery every 28 days, right? There's a slight difference between how that comes off to the supplier. But then number two, when it comes to the penalties, it gives you, as the procurement professional, more options at the negotiating table. So if you don't have those penalties in place, whether you use them or not, you have less leverage. Now, putting the penalties in place doesn't mean that every time a delivery is late, that you have to penalize the supplier. We shouldn't be in the business of constantly bringing upon supplier fees and whatnot, but we should be able to use that as an incentive for improvement. The other side that we might see to all of the things that we see on the details and some of the outcomes is that we are also focusing on the longevity of the relationship. We're thinking about how can we work with the supplier on not just getting what we want, but ensuring that they're successful in their roles as well. So we're getting those improved delivery times. We're enhancing the quality by understanding and doing more checks on the materials coming through and having a higher acceptance criteria. And we're doing cost saving measures that's going to help the vendor drive down some of their costs and hopefully pass those costs back to us, right? All of that can be inserted into an SOW. Once again, everybody, I'm gonna take a little bit of a breath, but if you have questions, thoughts, anything of that nature, please go ahead, throw it in the chat for me. So moving on to this next portion here is I want to talk about, when we have that example of an SOW of a supplier looking at that situation and saying, how can I transform that into an improvement plan? It takes those two different ways. The first way that I talked about here is that we actually can create an amendment to that original SOW based on certain key areas where we're seeing the opportunity at, and then turn that into that. Or we could do quite a few other things, right? We don't need the SOW or the amendment to the SOW in place in the way that we talked about it. We have other options that we can put on the table. And the part of the process that I would recommend as you go through this is have the performance improvement plan conversation with your vendors before your assessment is complete and before you put anything in stone, right? Before you add it to the contract. And what I mean by that is, let's take my example from before. You're a new employee somewhere, and what you want to do is to make sure that your performance is on par with the company's expectations. The only way for you to do that is for you to fully understand the expectations of the company. You cannot assume expectations. You could say, well, they want me to show up on time, and they want me to work extra hours, and they want me to make sure I'm speaking up in every meeting. And so that may be your experience at another company, right? So just as with a vendor, that may be their experience with another client. Even though that could be true in some situations, you would want to have that conversations because they could say, hey, Brandon, we don't care about those three things. What we care about is you being involved in strategic initiatives, you bringing specifically strategic value to your stakeholders and having those deeper conversations about the operations of the business. And we care about you developing our relationships with our suppliers, right? So same way that you could be misaligned with what you are doing or what the expectations of your company are, the supplier can be misaligned on what the expectations of you that you have as their client. And so involving them in that conversation, helping, pretty much asking the question of how would you like to be rated? Here are my suggestions about what's important to me, but what's important to you as a supplier as well. Having that two-way conversation is going to yield an immense amount of success over situations where you're solely working from, here's what I think that the supplier should do. Here are my thoughts on what we could do to improve here. So the first step we're going to look at, we have about 15 more minutes, everyone, until we do the activity. So you're only going to have to hear me kind of ramble about this stuff for another 15 minutes. And then I want to hear from you guys. And once again, I am monitoring the chat. If you guys have any thoughts, opinions, or anything of that nature that you want to put in there, feel free to do that. And I will even try to talk about it here. I really want to make this a collaborative discussion between all of us. We have quite a few people on the call. The first step that I want to look at is how do we identify what's important for us to work with the supplier on improving? How do we zone in on those opportunities where it's like, hey, here's what's happening that's a problem for me? And those are going to be our KPI sections, right? So the examples that we have there, delivery times, defect rates, cost adherence, and customer satisfaction, right? Those are just general examples that you could apply to generally any situation. But more specifically, when you're thinking about what this could be, think about for your specific project and for the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, what are going to be the main indicators of success, right? There are going to be sometimes when customer satisfaction, because of the nature of that type of business, is not going to be paramount, right? Unless it depends on like what does customer satisfaction actually look like. Let's take, I'm in IT, the world of IT, and I've been dealing with certain vendors for a long time. If you are also in IT, you might know a vendor called CDW, right? I've dealt with them almost at every single company that I've been at. And their KPIs are going to be very different from, let's say, an Accenture, right? So let's say we're dealing with CDW, and one of the things that they're doing for us is routinely configuring and delivering equipment for new employees, right? So CDW is a value-added reseller in the IT world that usually is a reseller of hardware coming from some of the major manufacturers. Think Dell, HP, all of those big companies. And what CDW is able to do is, let's say, for example, you don't have a strong IT staff at your organization. Maybe that's not your business. So a lot of what you do is outsource those IT services to a company like CDW, where you say, I need a computer for a new employee. What CDW could do then is say, all right, well, what do you need to have on the computer? Do you need these applications? Do you need Microsoft 360? Do you need all of that? Do you need all the other, do you need Power BI? How fast does it need to be? Does it need a specialized network card? So they're doing what they call configuring it. And so when we're thinking about what's important to us in those situations, we might say, all right, well, you're configuring it. One, we are going to need to be able to place rush orders that get us the computer within 7 business days. We'll just say that, right? Because we could hire an employee and they say, hey, they're starting in 2 weeks. Maybe they're starting in a week and a half. Maybe I just want it here in a week and a half so that I have it 3 days before they arrive. So it's on their desk. That is going to be a higher impact KPI for you in terms of timeliness because of what you need it for and how that could potentially impact your business. And then you might look at that and say, I need the accuracy of the configurations to also be a KPI, because if a computer shows up and an employee can't open Microsoft Word, for example, what do we do about that? Or if a computer shows up and it doesn't have any of the network or VM software on that, and employees that are remote can't connect to our system at all, what do we do about that, right? That's going to be a major impact to the business versus something like an Accenture, right? That says, hey, we're not doing configuration for you, but we're providing these consulting services. And a lot of our SOWs are going to be by level of effort and by more abstract deliverables that maybe say, hey, it's signed off when you say it's done, and it can't be just signed off because we delivered you a hard piece of equipment. So when we think about all that, we have to then move into how do we focus in on these things that are really important and then drive those most impactful elements all the way to the end for the improvement. So once we've identified it, then we have to say, well, now that I know the configurations are really important for me and the delivery times, how do I measure that against something else? Like, what could be right in that situation? So if I'm saying 7 business days, I'm also then saying, how does that compare to the market? Right? So I may go out and do some data collection and benchmarking that says, well, actually delivery times are more customary for 10 days for this fully configured piece of equipment, but we can break down the timeline and say that it needs to be at the CDW warehouse and configured within 3 business days, and then it will take an additional 5 business days to get it to the location, right? So we can kind of use that industry information, and we can also say, well, how long has it taken them to do it in the past? We can use that to set our actual benchmarks. So what we're doing throughout this process is also called creating the SMART goals for the supplier. We're targeting a specific section, a specific opportunity, and then we're building upon that with other industry information that we can pull from it. Now, I do understand that sometimes it's hard to get this data and kind of pull this all in. Part of it is if you have tools that are available to you, that's a good time to start getting good with them, or getting good at finding public sources of information, right? So if you are subscribed to a Gartner, that's great, but it can be pretty expensive. How can you also kind of contact some of these public sources or use that historical information to find that find those targets? So once you get the target down, you have to say, from this target, what is it going to take me to move up or down, depending on what that target is, to get into a sweet zone of that performance? So if I know that this company can deliver me configured laptops within 10 days, do I want to make it 9 days to kind of push them, right, for that improvement? Was I feeling before 10 days is too long? So at that point, we're communicating to the vendor. Once again, it's a very important part. You're communicating to the vendor what those expectations are, and you're also aligning with them on where the current environment is. From there, the recommendation is that you collaborate to build a timeline of when you're going to start seeing these improvements. Because if you leave it broad enough, you might be able to kind of get through an entire year with the vendor looking back and saying, well, you didn't tell me when I had to get it up to, down to 9 days or whatever the improvement was. But I am making progress toward it, right? So if you don't have any sort of hard data to work on, very difficult to then say, here's where you should be at in the process. And then you simply go through the implementation stage and monitoring it. And that's really just saying, let's start the work, right? Let's actually measure the progress that we're looking at. You might have tools available for that. You might have internal project management systems, or old school like me, I just typically use Excel or some sort of other kind of basic tracking mechanism. But I'm also communicating each step of the way, whether we agreed monthly, bi-weekly, communicating to the vendor what we see as progress. and then what they see as progress and aligning on that. So all of those concepts, I would imagine, are relatively clear for us. Now, in the chat, you know, we're coming up to the very collaborative part of our session today. I want to talk about the tools that you guys use before we get into that, right? So in the chat, we see 5 different types of tools, right? So this isn't everything in the world here, but I want to know, what are you guys using right now in your normal roles to measure or track your supplier performance? Are people using scorecards? Do you have any sort of dashboard that shows you the progress, whether that's a PowerPoint dashboard or something that is actually dynamic and built on, you know, a web platform or something different? Or do you have any sort of predictive analytics that say, if the supplier is trending in this direction, here's where we're going to go? So Janine says that they use scorecards and dashboards, so that's very helpful. And typically, those are going to be the 2 most common ones that I see in the industry. So to me, that's almost as if that's the base of where you would need to start with. Now, I would ask also the question, Janine, if you don't even mind answering for us, when do you choose, and anybody can answer this one, but when do you choose to actually use a scorecard and dashboard? Are there situations that you look at it and say, I'm not going to measure this vendor's performance versus I am, and here's the scorecard? So I'm saying, yep, for strategic suppliers. And that's the thing, everyone. We have to be realistic about our roles. We can't use scorecards and dashboards for every single supplier that we manage. Imagine managing 30 suppliers. How are you going to keep track of each of those scorecards in this setting versus, hey, I have 10 strategic suppliers. I'm able to keep a lot closer track of all them. I'm seeing a lot of people put in scorecards and dashboards. Wonderful, wonderful. And then Catherine has also said third-party software that provides reports, scorecards, and PowerPoint presentations. To me, that's interesting, right? So it's taking you through some of that raw data that they're working with and helping you produce some of the actionable insights with the presentations. And then scorecards with 3 measurement points. All right, so very specific on that. That's an interesting one, Geoff. And then really quick on here is just the implementation and the follow-up portion. And then shortly here, we're going to move on over to the crafting portion of the SOW. And this is just going to be, I'll explain it to you guys in detail in a moment, but I really want to start hearing from you guys during that. And then if possible, Kathy, and I don't know if this is, but if we could even unmute some mics where people could explain and talk about their experiences as well, I'd be very open to hearing that. So when we think about the implementation and follow-up, just a few key things that I want to point out here, right? Like I said before, crafting that SOW, that scorecard, that improvement plan needs to be done with the supplier. You as the procurement professional should be bringing your recommendations and kind of serving as that trusted advisor to your stakeholders. And remember here, your stakeholders can be internal and external. So your internal stakeholders are going to be your typical ones: finance, your engineers, your working group, operations. And then your external stakeholders are going to be your customers and your suppliers. So you typically know what your customers could want, right? That's not always connected to procurement, but you're usually getting that information from somewhere. But it then becomes up to procurement to know what the suppliers want. So in my current environment, a lot of our suppliers have to work with one another, right? They usually have to collaborate in some way. Maybe they're relying on information from another third-party vendor, but usually there's a lot of collaboration that goes on there. And part of our process then becomes, how do we understand what they want out of that? Which is, hey, vendors have come and said, I need better communication with these leaders so that I can collaborate with these vendors on a more efficient level. So I need to understand what the plans are for these leaders and how they're going to develop our infrastructure, how they're going to change our footprint, whatever it may be, so that when I have conversations with your other vendor, we're all on the same page and we're not kind of confused because one leader is saying that we're increasing and another one saying that we're decreasing. So when we're thinking about this overall plan, communication is going to be a big piece of it. And then continuously collecting that feedback and finding ways to pinpoint the source of the problem and then solving that problem are going to be critical. So think about this quick tip as an example here, especially when you're building out your scorecard. If you've ever kind of taken one of my courses before, maybe we've met, you might have heard me talk about the 5 whys technique. So as you're building out the scorecard and as you're thinking about what's important and where are your pain points, right? You might say to yourself, well, one of my pain points is the vendor is consistently behind on deadlines that I put forth, and it's always taking them a long time to make a decision. Part of this 5 whys process is then you start to say why. Well, I think it might be taking them a little bit long because usually they communicate some sort of roadblock along the way. And you say, well, why do they communicate a roadblock? Well, the roadblocks typically come when they're doing work on our behalf and we have another supplier that then says, hey, we need other confirmations. And then you say, well, why don't we have those other confirmations? Well, we don't have that because nobody actually sent these confirmations to some of these key suppliers. And so we've asked why 5 times on something that the vendor was doing that was impactful in a negative way on our relationship. And we got to the root of it and we said, all right, well, here's the barrier that I'm going to remove for this vendor. And then here's now that we've kind of agreed on what the root of the issue is, here's going to be the KPI, the scorecard, the thing that I'm measuring and following up with that we can continuously improve upon, right? So I'm taking still the days due of a task, and I'm saying if we implemented this change, will those days due or days received per task go down as we want it to, right? And so we're measuring it, we're being flexible, we're taking in that data, and we're saying, all right, what do we need to do as this is ongoing in order to make a change here? All right. So we're going to have a craft your SOW section. I'm going to read this off for us. And we're going to just start having the conversation around how would you build out this SOW. Now, a quick feat here is this entire time, Kathy in the background has been helping us out with trying to get an easy way for us to answer these questions together and have a really good conversation about it. But before we jump into that, I just want to give you that little prelude. I'm going to read this to us. So imagine that you're a procurement manager at a leading manufacturing company. We're going to call this Apex Manufacturing. And you have a key supplier, Prime Materials, that's been experiencing significant performance issues. Over the past 6 months, there have been frequent late deliveries, and the quality of materials has been inconsistent, leading to production delays and increased cost. This situation is causing customer dissatisfaction and putting your company reputation at risk, right? So their performance levels are reaching the end customer, and that could really affect the future and longevity of your company. So the challenge that you have here is you've already had discussions with them and you've made some changes, but things are not improving. So you're saying, let's get some of this actually down on paper and figure out what plan needs to be put in place to really turn this relationship around. So imagine before you're doing this very informally. You're saying like, hey guys, I noticed that this was late. Or, hey guys, I heard about another unsatisfied internal stakeholder when they received the materials and they're coming to me and complaining about the material quality. Like maybe you're having those conversations with them, you're communicating your dissatisfaction, but because it's not actually down on a plan, you're not seeing the changes. So you're saying, you're one of our strategic vendors, you can affect my sales, so let's start working together to identify some of the KPIs, put together some SMART goals, and then have a step-by-step plan for how we're going to improve. So meaning, let's think about 3 actions based on the pathing that we go through, 3 actions that could help us out, and then 3 parties that would be responsible for those, for carrying a lot of that forward. It can be us, it can be the supplier, however it is. So, Kathy, I will, have we been able to do the poll together, Kathy? Perfect. So everybody, poll number 1. Let's talk about KPIs. There are no fully right answers here, right? I want to really just have this discussion with everybody. So you see a poll that has popped up. Which KPIs are critical for the comprehensive assessment of supplier performance in this scenario? Let's just choose the top 3, everyone. We could include all of these realistically, but we need to find the main ones that could help us out for this particular situation of the scenario. So, all right, I'm seeing a lot of the answers come in. Right now, almost everybody is at least saying the defect rates. So we're seeing a few people that haven't. We're also seeing delivery times really high up there. And then also, everybody, as these results come in and you have something that you would like to add, kind of with your voice and all that, please feel free to raise your hand and we would be glad to unmute you. All right, so we've gotten a majority of the responses in, and then also we've gotten a comment here: delivery times, defect rates, lead time variability. So the top ones, everybody, I'll just read off the very top ones. Well, actually, that was the top ones that I read off from the comment. So delivery times, that was number 1 for the KPIs, defect rates, number 2, and then lead time variability as number 3. Now, a close 4 was cost control. And the interesting part to me is if we do scroll back here and we think about cost control, we do see, I guess you could kind of factor some of that in when we talk about the frequently late deliveries and the quality of materials and how that could lead to other cost issues. But I can't see why that would come in number 4. Now, the other side to that, though, is cost controls could lead to other efficiencies even further down the line. So that is an interesting perspective there. Thank you for that, Kathy, and for putting that poll together. I'm going to go ahead and hit share results so everybody can see that I'm not fibbing here. All right. I'm going to say stop sharing. Let's move on to the next one. So the next step, everyone, we've put the KPIs together. We've decided on our top couple ones that we're going to focus on. And now we need to figure out how are we going to actually set those limits to them. So how would you gather and validate your baseline data in this situation? And let's think about how we're seeing other people kind of respond to this, because I could see quite a few other people do this one. And then this is also preferably not multiple choice, everybody. Just pick the one that you think is going to be best here. Now, it could be multiple that you would realistically do, but here I'm just looking to have the conversation on, for this particular situation, where do we think is going to be most critical? I'm seeing an interesting majority right now go to historical performance. Kind of taking a look at those records. And then as you're choosing this, if you would like, go ahead and put your reasoning in the chat, or even raise your hand to kind of say, why would you choose one over the other? So if anybody's willing to, I would love to hear from the top 2 groups that we have right now, which is if you've chosen review historical performance records. I want to understand why you chose that one maybe over conducting a supplier performance audit, right? So one is kind of looking past and the other one is kind of just reviewing the information that you have on hand. But I kind of want to understand some of the differences there. If anybody wants to raise their hands and talk about if you were in one of those 2 groups, either the audit group or the performance, historical performance, let me know a little bit about why one over the other. So it looks like Janine has raised her hand. Kathy, are we able to unmute Janine? That's a little difficult for me to find it.
Yes, I think I'm unmuted. This is Janine.
Right.
Can you hear me?
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I selected to conduct supplier performance audits over the historical performance, because if the supplier is just providing that historical performance, I am unsure of where the data is coming from. So if I am doing the audit, I would actually understand where the data is coming from and validate that data a little bit more than just looking at the historical performance.
Let me ask a quick question about that, Janine, because I agree a lot with your perspective. Would you ever feel like you would be in a situation to get pushback based on the cost of performing that audit, right? So that's a little bit of the trade-off that you would have to have. Who's going to do the audit? Who's going to pay for the audit? Where the resources going to come from? Does that also factor in, or does the guarantee of better data for you or more trusted data trump the potential increased cost?
So I would look that data would trump the cost. Just having the accuracy of that data would be a cost savings according to those performance kind of records.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would actually agree in that way. And then another quick question: would you
Yes.
do it entirely internally, or would you hire a third party?
Oh, I would look to do it internally.
Okay.
Again, looking at the costs across the board. But if, just to validate that data, possibly using a third party.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too. If there was anything that said, hey, maybe the data is not the most full of integrity, right? Maybe we
Mhm.
can bring in a third party if we have any questions about the data quality there. To
Agreed.
me, the other benefit of third parties that I sometimes see is they find stuff that we weren't even looking for, right? So to me,
Very,
that's a good one there. So
very
thank you
true.
very much for that, Janine. I really
Thank you.
appreciate that.
No problem.
Anybody on the review historical performance now that Janine has kind of given her opinion about it? Anybody want to kind of speak in about that? Or somebody that's using industry benchmarks or the implementing real-time performance monitoring systems. Anybody from any other groups that would like to give their opinion? So Tammy in the chat has said the conducting supplier performance audits will be a forthcoming plan to assist with the problem. I do like that one. And that is an interesting one, Mike. So historical data to have a more accurate baseline, benchmarks might tell you where you want them to go, right? So that's an interesting one because you might say, hey, we're not going to use a benchmark as our baseline because we don't even know where we're coming from. What if we're coming from something even higher than the benchmark would be, right? So you don't want to kind of go into a declining performance plan. So that's kind of what I'm reading from yours, Mike. And then Michelle has said historical, that's the quickest data to obtain. I do like that one. I guess it does depend on if you're working with limited time, like depending on the type of situation. I guess if you had something like, 6 months to a year and a half, that'd be very different there. All right, anybody else want to raise their hand and anything else to kind of add? All right, let's move on to the tools and techniques section here.
Hey,
So,
Brandon, we have Sherry.
oh, perfect.
She's able to talk now.
Sherry, let's go for it, Sherry. I'm gonna go back to this.
Oh, yes, I apologize. I think I raised my hand just a bit late, just to add a bit of commentary. I also felt like conducting supplier audits was a bit preferable. Admittedly, I went historical, like right from the get-go, because I felt like, oh, that's easy, historical performance. Yeah, that's how you validate data. You have historical performance data. That's how we know we have a performance issue. And then the more I started to think through, the different options, I went to, oh, of course, well, we want some industry data. And then, oh, real-time performance, that's, kind of out of the realm of easy and cost effective. So then I started to think through the supplier audit, and I agreed with Janine and some of the other folks in the chat, but I started thinking maybe a little off the reservation, but I was thinking more broad spectrum, that we may be able to get data, like more widespread data beyond just our company data, to see, are we an isolated performance incident, or is this happening across a larger pool of clients? Is there, like, thinking in terms of like the root cause, doing like an RCA, what really is the root cause? Is it something with our account? Is it something bigger, broader with the supplier, where they have, a larger issue going on, where they would need to remediate something on a larger scale that impacts more than just us, and it's several clients? And then, of course, you get into, like you were talking about, size, scale, cost, who is doing these types of audits, frequency, do you need staff? It opens up a whole can of worms. So I think if resources would be available and the supplier would be willing to provide access to some of that broad, spectrum information, so that you would know if this is more isolated to you, your industry, your,
Yeah.
scale of business, whatever, that might be helpful, or if it's more on their side. So I don't know, that's where my mind went.
And Sherry, no, that's fantastic. And thank you so much for sharing that. I think that, kind of as you were speaking about that, I'm sure everybody else on the call, their mind is kind of going to all these other situations where that would be completely relevant. When I think about what you said, I imagine I once consulted with a client that was in the manufacturing space, and they were contracting with a vendor that was typically in the pharmaceutical space.
Mhm.
And so this vendor really wanted to break out of that category. They did not want to be known as the pharmaceutical vendor for that product. And they were really pushing to get this manufacturing client. And then when they did, they weren't performing as well as they did with their other companies. And part of the thought there is like, well, you have all this other experience and this expertise there, like you do that well. So your reputation could be a 10 out of 10. But if you're only dealing with these clients that you do perform well with, of course, that's your reputation. So then kind of what you're saying, Sherry, is like, hey, is it me? It's kind of like one of those bad breakups, right? It's me, not you, right? Where it's like, hey, maybe it's our industry, maybe it's how we're working together, maybe it's something that we're not providing to you, something along those lines in general, right? That then say, should we be looking at the broader spectrum rather than this? Because I do see what you're saying. If you contain all of it just between you and the supplier without being able to kind of compare what that specific supplier is potentially doing with other customers, it's really hard to get a picture on where could that root cause be for it. So thank you,
Right.
Sherry.
Macro level versus micro level analytics.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Anybody else want to add to that before we move on to the next question here? We have about 15 minutes left, so we can get a few questions in, but we do got to move on to this next section. All right, so maybe if you do have something to say, feel free to raise your hand, talk about this one. But we're going to move on to poll number 3 now, everybody, talking about the tools and techniques. So which ones do you need? Select your top 2. So we talked a little bit about this before. My predictions before anything comes in is that supplier scorecards and the dashboards are going to come in the top 2. Just because, as we were talking about it before, that's what a lot of people were saying. But I would love to see what people's experiences have been. And then also, while we're getting these questions in, if anybody has used predictive analytics or blockchain in any sort of way, please raise your hand. I would love to hear about that. I would love to hear about your experiences, how you used it, if you thought it was successful. And looks like we might have one person at least that's used predictive analytics. I don't know who that person is. The votes are anonymous, everyone. But if you are somebody that's voted for predictive analytics and you are comfortable speaking, I would love to hear your experience with that. And then also, as we pull this up, I'm also interested, and not that the other categories that I'm not interested in, I just feel like we've already somewhat talked a little bit about scorecards and the dashboards, but I am trying to think about like, hey, how do we kind of expand out that box a little bit? For people that are using collaborative platforms, what do those look like as well? What are your collaborative platforms? Are they a custom system that you're building? Do they have you and various stakeholders kind of inserting information into them? What do they look like? Oh, I got a Janine.
Okay. Yes, I'm off mute. I'm sorry. So I selected the predictive analytics and also the collaborative platforms for continuous improvement.
Okay.
So we have not started, but this is a new initiative that we're looking to dive into. So that's what I'd like to start utilizing instead of the supplier scorecards and dashboards. So, we're looking to look at trends and seeing, based on this time of year, are we going to see an increase in cost here for certain initiatives or for certain outages, things like that. And then those collaborative platforms, we're looking to build that in-house as well, and looking to get our stakeholder feedback into more of that continuous improvement along the way of those scorecards. So integrating the scorecards and getting that the stakeholder feedback, and then integrating that and producing more of that scorecard for that continuous improvement.
Right. And I like that a lot, actually. So you're really thinking about how can we be more forward, future thinking versus kind of some of the past. And you're really looking at that to kind of get you some of the results and whatnot.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. I love that, Janine. Thank you. Really appreciate you sharing. All right, everybody. So the answers are in. Most people, kind of as we predicted, are using supplier scorecards. And so to me, that is somewhat of the standard across the industry. Nothing's wrong with supplier scorecards. I think that it is our basic standard practice that we should be doing. But then I also think that what Janine was saying is pretty interesting. Like, if we are really looking toward the future, what else can we actually do to make better decisions? And some of that does involve predictive analytics. So we only had one person on the predictive analytics, and that was Janine for us. We had the second largest group being real-time analytics dashboards. And then the last one, collaborative platforms for continuous improvement. All right, so this one's going to be a little different, everybody. We have about a little over 10 minutes left, so I do want to run through this relatively quickly. So this one, you're just going to be using the chat, all right? So we don't have any more polls that we need to do, but this is all going to be around what are you inserting in the chat for in terms of SMART goals, right? So think about, and then also Sharon has asked a few people in the chat here, so sorry for missing here. So Mike has said one element to consider is what is the possible long-term plan? And if it's possible to exit the supplier, but you need runway before the exit, right? So everybody knows that if you're involved in a complicated, thread of different things with the supplier, turning them off is very not possible overnight, right? You need some sort of plan in place that says, how do we exit? And so he's saying he had focused less on collaboration and more on holding the incumbent accountable. So that's an interesting point there, Mike. Mike, if you have a mic available, that's an interesting way to say it, but if you are available to speak to us, I would love if you wanted to expand on that a little bit. If you were able to raise your hand. Actually, I'm going to just do if you wanted to, Mike, I'm doing the allow to talk. Sure. And then you should be able to go for it.
Okay. Yeah, I think, just having worked with some places where it's either a very, I'll call an oligopoly as a market, so you don't have a lot of choice, or where you've got suppliers that are very unique, you might need to focus more on collaboration, even though they are causing a lot of problems for you and for your production and therefore for your customers. But if you've got that, in those cases, the collaborative approach, I think, makes a lot of sense to bake in, along with getting some sense of where you currently stand and where you need to get to. When, on the other hand, if you've got a situation where you can't just turn them off because you need to actually make sure you've got continuous supply, but you're in a position to at least consider an alternate supplier, I guess I'd focus more on how do you triage. And that's where I think the scorecarding and the kind of the real-time data capture makes a lot of sense without focusing on the longer-term partnership, right? See if you can be a long-term partner or continue your long-term partnership if they can perform, but if they can't perform, chances are your folks who are on the production side of the process and dealing with inferior deliveries, late deliveries, incorrect products, et cetera, are going to be beating the drum pretty loudly for procurement to help them make a change.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So I see what you're saying there. So part of your thought is you could have on one side where a vendor, you see them in your long-term future, you see them as really adding to the organization and things are kind of going well. That's an opportunity for collaboration. And then on the other side, we're like, hey, this vendor's causing some havoc for us. We don't really know if there's going to be a long-term partnership here. We need to fix the immediate problem. There's not really the room for collaboration, but more about how do we measure their current performance to say, here's where we need change at now. Is that kind of what you're thinking here?
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's a really good point there, Mike. And I do agree with you. I think that at some point we do have to kind of flip the switch in ourselves and say, there's a moment that we need to step away from being collaborative and kind of putting on the mean face, if you will. So thank you for that, Mike. Really appreciate you sharing that. And then Sharon had asked the question of any thought on how blockchain may be used. If anybody has any answer for this, please feel free to raise your hand. But Sharon, my quick answer would be, let's say, for example, you wanted to gather data on exact delivery schedules and times, like who was accountable for the product whenever it reached a certain stage. I would imagine blockchain being used like that. Let's say I'm getting some network equipment from China. Blockchain would help me understand when exactly did it leave the port, when did it get onto the boat, when did it reach the States, when did it get onto the second vessel. It would help me understand each step of the way so I can hold each different party accountable for if there were delays, or I could reward them if there were improved efficiency. So that's how I see blockchain. It takes a little bit of that measuring and reporting out of the vendor's hands and actually puts it into strict data collection methods that cannot be altered, and we don't need to kind of go off to them for the reporting of. All right, everybody. So I wanted to leave a little bit of time for some of our just general Q&A. So I'm going to go through this relatively quickly here. But if you guys have thoughts around for this particular situation, how would you insert the SMART improvement goals? I would love to see that in the chat, right? So if you don't know what SMART is, you've been looking at it on the screen for a while now, but it's specific, measurable, achievable, and relevant, and time bound. So I went ahead and I created a short example for us to look at for this particular situation, right? So let's say our specific goal here is that we're going to reduce delivery times. And so another part, so all of these don't have to be a part of the same piece, but it should be all around our overall goal of improvement, right? So another part of what's measurable for us is that we would say, hey, the quality of the materials was a really big issue. So the measurement is going to be less than 1% defect rate. What's achievable? Implement quality checks, right? So that's also connected to some of the materials that we're working with. So if we simply implement that, we could measure the defect rate and hopefully lead to the specific goals. And it's relevant because this will improve on delivery time, and we think that we can do this in 6 months, right? So as you're putting those goals down, as you're thinking about like, how do I look at the KPIs, right? That's where we started from all the way until this point. These are the ways that we can actually start putting that plan in place. And then the next thing that we need to do, everybody, and once again, if you want to put this in the chat around what you think some of the SMART goals should be, or what you think one of the most important ones should be, feel free to do that as well. The second thing that you also need to have here are going to be your actions, and then who might be responsible for those actions. So part of what you can think about is like, all right, if I need to achieve kind of what we saw on this previous one here, right? I need to achieve less than 1% defect rate. What is going to be the potential action that helps me do that? And, you know, if I'm trying to improve on certain other things, like whatever your KPIs are. And then here's the example that we might see from that, right? So the first action is new monitoring system, right? So something that we were doing before wasn't working, so we'll put something new in there, and it's going to be led by the procurement team. And then second action is we have regular audits. And actually, the other way that we can kind of write this is multiple responsibilities can also handle multiple actions and kind of cross improvements there. So this could be a cross-functional team that each of them are kind of relying on one another to do certain pieces, right? So I could see procurement handling action 1 as far as the facilitator and purchaser, but then also action 3 as somebody who is able to bring various groups together to have productive conversations, right? So for whatever your KPIs are for your SOW, you would at least need to be able to decide what are the things that we need to do. Like you would really realistically put together a full project plan of what are we doing, when are we doing it, and who's responsible for it. So let's kind of put our minds in the situation of we got all this stuff done. We get this note back from our stakeholder, and it says, I'm excited to share. And really all of this is once you're able to do that, these are the type of emails that you might get back, right? This is what we expect for our stakeholders to be able to say to us. You know, we've made some great progress by putting this performance improvement plan in place. We focus on key metrics like delivery times, defect rates, and lead time variability, and then also setting clear goals. Cutting delivery times by 20% and getting defect rates below 1%. So our stakeholder is actually being able to point to specific measurements of the relationship that we were able to improve, and then how we were able to do that. And then they finish off saying, this is getting back on track. We're keeping those regular check-ins to make sure that nothing else slips through the cracks, and that we continue to improve and keep pushing these principles into the proper areas, right? So that's the type of messaging that we get through. And I know we only have a few minutes, everybody, but before we go, and I know a lot of people are going to start dropping off, but I just wanted to also say thank you guys, right? A lot of what I believe it is, whether you learn something brand new today or not, a lot of what we did here was have a discussion, share some things, and work on our own continuous improvement. Maybe this wasn't exactly new information, but hopefully it was shared information that says, all right, what are some things that I need to remind myself of? That's what these lunch and learns are for. Maybe I haven't used a score. Maybe you're somebody in the audience right now that's like, hey, I used a scorecard, but the last one was 5 years ago, right? How do I get reinvigorated about getting back into scorecards, back into improving suppliers? Or maybe you're dealing with a supplier right now and you're like, wow, I don't know what to do with them. I've told them about all my problems and they're still not improving. Maybe this is the moment where you're saying, I need to get it on paper. And maybe this is the pick me up over lunch that I needed. But all right, everybody, Q&A session until we close out. Any questions, any thoughts, any comments, any concerns, anybody? I'd be happy to give you the stage or let you ask your question. And then Kathy, as we close out here, because I know that I'm not sure if we'll get any questions for the last couple of minutes. Do you have anything to add, Kathy, or any thoughts about today?
I just want to thank you. This was this was a really great presentation. I really appreciate you bringing this to our audience today. And I really, really do appreciate everybody who put in their information in the polls, in the chat, and came on and started, having dialogue with you, Brandon, and made it very, very interactive.
Yeah, no, and I really do think the people that spoke up as well, and Mike, Janine, and all the others, you guys have been great. It was just great having you on and being able to share that. And I'm sure if we had longer together, we'd have even greater conversations. And so, Kathy, when you invite me to these, I always love it. This was made just for this group today. So I'm really happy that we were able to have a really good conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Brandon. And again, thank you everybody for joining us today. And I'll tell you, we're going to ask Brandon back. So don't worry on another topic.
Would love to come back, Kathy.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody. And as I said, have a great day. Enjoy the rest of your week as well.
All right. Thank you. Talk to you later.